The sun beat down relentlessly on Grace Gallagher's slender shoulders as she struggled with the heavy wooden bucket at the town well. Sweat trickled down her temple, and her arms trembled under the weight of the water-filled pail that refused to budge more than a few inches off the ground. Desperation etched across her face as she glanced around the dusty main street of Silverstone, Arizona Territory, 1878. Not a soul in sight on this scorching afternoon to lend her a hand. "Seems like you could use some help with that, madam." The deep, rumbling voice startled her. Grace spun around, nearly losing her grip on the bucket handle. A tall man stood before her, the late afternoon sun silhouetting his broad-shouldered frame. The stranger stepped forward, and she caught sight of kind eyes beneath the brim of a well-worn Stetson. "I'm quite capable, thank you," Grace replied, though her aching arms betrayed her words. The stranger's lips curved into a gentle smile. Without another word, he reached down and lifted the heavy bucket with ease, as if it weighed no more than a feather pillow. "Where to?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Grace hesitated, torn between her pride and practicality. "The Mercantile," she finally answered, gesturing toward the weathered wooden building across the street. "I'm much obliged, Mr. Wyatt Morrison." He tipped his hat slightly. "And you are Grace Gallagher." The bucket of water sloshed gently as they crossed the rutted dirt street, Grace's emerald green skirt gathering dust along its hem. She studied him from the corner of her eye, tall and lean, with sun-bronzed skin that spoke of long days under the open sky. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the revolver at his hip looked well-maintained. "New to Silverstone?" she asked, noticing how the few townsfolk they passed watched the stranger with curious eyes. "Just rode in this morning," Wyatt confirmed. "Been working cattle drives up north, but thought I might find something more permanent here." Grace nodded. "Not much here but the silver mine, ranches, and folks just trying to make a living. And pretty ladies who take on more than they can carry," he added with that same soft smile. A blush rose to Grace's cheeks as they reached the Mercantile. "This is fine, thank you. I can manage from here." Wyatt set the bucket down carefully. "Are you sure? Looks like you might be cleaning up." He gestured to the nearly empty store where buckets and mops stood propped against a wall. "I'm the new proprietor," Grace explained, lifting her chin with pride. "Just purchased the place from old Mr. Henderson last week. First woman-owned business in Silverstone." Interest flickered in Wyatt's eyes. "That's quite an accomplishment." "Some would say it's quite foolish," she countered. "A woman alone running a business in a mining town." "I'd say it takes courage," Wyatt replied, "and determination." Their eyes met for a moment longer than necessary. Grace was the first to look away, reaching for the store door. "Well, Mr. Morrison, thank you again for your assistance." "My pleasure, Miss Gallagher." He touched the brim of his hat. "Perhaps I'll stop by tomorrow, find myself in need of supplies." Grace nodded, watching as he turned and headed toward the saloon across the street. She couldn't help but notice the easy confidence in his stride, or the way several townspeople nodded respectfully as he passed. Interesting, she thought, for a man who claimed to be new in town. Inside the Mercantile, Grace placed the water bucket near the mop and began wiping down the dusty shelves. The store had been neglected in old Mr. Henderson's final months, and she was determined to transform it into something respectable. A store where both the rough miners and the proper ladies of town would feel welcome to shop. As she worked, she found her thoughts drifting to Wyatt Morrison and his unexpected kindness. It had been a long time since anyone had smiled at her that way, warm and genuine, without wanting something in return. After 2 years of widowhood, she had grown accustomed to the pitying glances, the not-so-subtle suggestions that she needed a new husband, and worst of all, the inappropriate advances from men who thought a widow was desperate for male attention. Grace had come to Silverstone seeking a fresh start, a place where her past wouldn't follow her. Using the small inheritance her husband had left her, she had purchased the mercantile, determined to build something that was truly hers, something no one could take away. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Grace rose early, as was her habit, and dressed carefully in a simple blue dress with her hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck. She had just finished arranging a new display of canned goods when the bell above the door jingled. "Good morning, Miss Gallagher." Wyatt Morrison stood in the doorway, looking fresher than he had the day before. He'd clearly found time for a bath and a shave, though his clothes remained the same trail-worn attire. "Mr. Morrison," she greeted him with a polite nod. "What can I help you with today? Thought I'd pick up some supplies." He wandered through the narrow aisles, examining her modest inventory. "Got any work gloves? Mine are about worn through." Grace moved to a shelf behind the counter. "What size?" "Large, I reckon." He held up his hands, and Grace couldn't help but notice they were strong yet surprisingly uncalloused for a cowboy. "Here," she said, placing a pair on the counter. "These should do." "Anything else?" Wyatt added tobacco, matches, and a few other necessities to his pile. As Grace tallied his purchases, he leaned against the counter. "So how does a fine lady like yourself end up running a mercantile in a rough and tumble place like Silverstone?" Grace's hand stilled momentarily. "I could ask you a similar question, Mr. Morrison. You don't strike me as the typical drifting cowhand." A shadow passed over his face. "We all have our stories, don't we?" He straightened up. "How about we make a trade? You tell me your tale, I'll tell you mine. Over dinner, perhaps?" Grace's eyebrows rose. "That's quite forward of you, sir." "Just being neighborly," he replied with that same disarming smile. "Besides, I heard Widow Peabody's boarding house serves a fine stew on Wednesdays." Grace hesitated. It had been a long time since she'd accepted any social invitation, particularly from a man. But there was something about Wyatt Morrison that seemed trustworthy, despite the mysteries that clearly surrounded him. "Widow Peabody's, you say?" She wrapped his purchases in brown paper. 7 o'clock. His smile broadened. "I'll be there at 6:30 to escort you." After Wyatt left, Grace found herself smiling as she went about her day. The steady stream of customers kept her busy, miners picking up tobacco and candy, ranch hands needing new work gloves, and the respectable ladies of town examining her fabric selections. By late afternoon, her feet ached and her back protested, but her spirits remained high. At 6 o'clock, she closed the shop and hurried to her small room above the store. She changed into her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes and pinched her cheeks for color. It wasn't vanity, she told herself, just respect for the social occasion. Precisely at 6:30, a knock sounded at her door. Wyatt stood outside, his hat in his hands, wearing a clean shirt she hadn't seen before. "You look lovely, Miss Gallagher," he said, his admiration evident in his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." She accepted his offered arm as they walked the short distance to Widow Peabody's boarding house. The evening passed pleasantly. Widow Peabody's stew was indeed excellent, and the conversation flowed easily between them. Grace found herself telling Wyatt about her late husband, Thomas, and their brief marriage cut short by tuberculosis. She spoke of her decision to leave St. Louis and start anew in the Arizona Territory. "And what of you, Mr. Morrison?" she asked, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "You promised me your story in exchange for mine." Wyatt's expression grew serious. "I was a lawman back in Texas, deputy sheriff in a small town not unlike this one." "Was?" Grace prompted when he fell silent. "Let's just say things didn't end well." He toyed with his coffee cup. I needed a fresh start, same as you. Grace sensed there was much more to the story, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West had secrets, things they'd rather leave buried in their past. As they walked back to the Mercantile under a canopy of stars, Wyatt suddenly stopped. I should tell you, Miss Gallagher, I'm staying in town for a while. Sheriff Tate offered me a deputy position this afternoon. Grace's eyes widened. You're accepting it? I am. His gaze was steady. Does that trouble you? No, she replied honestly. I think you'll make a fine deputy. They reached her door and an awkward silence fell between them. Thank you for a pleasant evening, Mr. Morrison. Wyatt, he corrected gently. I think we can dispense with formalities now, don't you? Then you must call me Grace. She extended her hand, which he took but didn't immediately release. Good night, Grace, he said, his voice low. For a moment she thought he might kiss her hand, but he simply gave it a gentle squeeze before letting go. I'll see you around town. Grace watched him walk away, a curious mixture of emotions swirling within her. It had been so long since she'd felt this way, this strange fluttering in her chest, this anticipation of seeing someone again. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable pattern. Wyatt would stop by the Mercantile several times a week, sometimes to purchase small items, other times just to chat. Grace found herself looking forward to these visits, to his easy smile and the way he listened intently when she spoke. Word spread quickly about the new deputy, and Grace heard the gossip. Wyatt was fair but firm with troublemakers, quick to break up fights at the saloon before they escalated, respected by the miners and cowboys alike. Even Sheriff Tate, a gruff man not known for compliments, was heard remarking that hiring Morrison was the best decision he'd made in years. One rainy afternoon, as Grace was struggling to patch a leak in the Mercantile's roof, the bell over the door jangled. Wyatt entered, shaking water from his hat. Grace, where are you? Up here. She called from the ladder where she was precariously balanced, trying to position a bucket to catch the drips. Wyatt looked up, alarm crossing his features. What in heaven's name are you doing up there? What does it look like? I'm trying to save my inventory from getting soaked. Wyatt was beside the ladder in 3 long strides. Come down from there before you break your neck. I'm perfectly capable, I'm sure you are, he interrupted. But that doesn't mean you should be climbing ladders during a thunderstorm. Come down, please. Something in his tone concern rather than condescension made Grace relent. She carefully descended the ladder. Now, Wyatt said, taking off his rain-soaked coat, show me where the leak is and I'll fix it properly. For the next hour, Grace watched as Wyatt patched her roof, his movements efficient and sure. When he finally climbed down, his shirt was damp with sweat and rain, clinging to the muscular contours of his chest. Thank you, Grace said, handing him a cup of hot coffee. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to. He accepted the coffee gratefully. Besides, can't have Silverstone's finest Mercantile flooded out, can we? Their fingers brushed as he took the cup, sending an unexpected jolt through Grace. She stepped back quickly, busying herself with straightening already neat shelves. Grace, Wyatt said softly. There's a social at the church this Saturday. Would you do me the honor of accompanying me? Grace turned, surprised. The church social was the most respectable gathering in town, attended by all the prominent citizens. To go with Wyatt would be a public statement of sorts. I'd like that, she found herself saying. Saturday evening arrived clear and mild. Grace wore her best dress and even splurged on a dab of rose water behind her ears. When Wyatt arrived to escort her, dressed in a clean suit that emphasized his broad shoulders, she felt a flutter of nerves she hadn't experienced since she was a girl. The church hall was decorated with wildflowers and lanterns, and Mrs. Patterson's piano playing filled the air with lively tunes. Grace noticed the glances and whispers as she entered on Wyatt's arm, but for once, she didn't care what others thought. "May I have this dance?" Wyatt asked as Mrs. Patterson began a waltz. "I haven't danced in years," Grace admitted. "Neither have I," he said with a wink. "We can stumble together." But they didn't stumble. Wyatt led with surprising grace, his hand warm and steady at her waist, guiding her around the floor. Grace felt light, almost giddy as they whirled among the other couples. "You're a natural," she told him as the music ended. "Or perhaps I just have the right partner," he replied, his eyes never leaving hers. The evening passed in a blur of dancing, laughter, and conversation. Grace couldn't remember the last time she'd enjoyed herself so thoroughly. As they walked home under a canopy of stars, Wyatt's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining naturally. At her door, he hesitated. "Grace." Whatever he intended to say was interrupted by shouts from down the street. They both turned to see a man running toward them, his face pale in the moonlight. "Deputy Morrison," the man called. "There's trouble at the Silver Dollar. Miners and cowboys about to tear the place apart." Wyatt's expression hardened. "I have to go." He squeezed Grace's hand. "Lock your door." Grace watched him hurry away, his hand already on his revolver. It was a stark reminder that despite the peaceful evening they'd shared, Silverstone was still a frontier town where violence could erupt at any moment. The next morning, Grace heard the full story from customers in her store. A dispute over a card game had escalated into a full-scale brawl. Wyatt and Sheriff Tate had managed to restore order, but not before several men were injured. One cowboy had pulled a knife, they said, and would have stabbed another man if Deputy Morrison hadn't intervened. When Wyatt stopped by later that day, Grace noticed the bruise on his jaw and the way he favored his right side. "You're hurt," she said, reaching out to touch his face before catching herself. "It's nothing," he assured her. "Just part of the job. Was it worth it?" she asked. "Breaking up a fight between drunken fools." Something flashed in his eyes. "Every man deserves a chance to walk away and start fresh the next day, Grace. Even drunken fools." His words stayed with her long after he left. There was something in the way he'd said it, a conviction that spoke of personal experience. A week later, Grace was closing up the store when she heard rapid hoofbeats approaching. Looking out the window, she saw a cloud of dust and then several riders pulling up outside. Sheriff Tate was at their head, his face grim. "Miss Gallagher," he called, dismounting. "Have you seen Deputy Morrison today?" "Not since this morning," she replied, a knot of worry forming in her stomach. "What's happened?" "Bank in Tucson was robbed 3 days ago," Tate said. "One of the bandits was captured. Says his partner headed this way. Goes by the name of Jack Wilson." The name meant nothing to Grace. "What does this have to do with Wyatt?" Sheriff Tate exchanged glances with one of the men beside him. "This man claims Wilson and Morrison used to ride together back in Texas." Grace's heart sank. "That's ridiculous. Wyatt was a deputy sheriff in Texas." "So he told you," another man said, stepping forward. He wore a marshal's badge. "Madam, I'm U.S. Marshal Fletcher. We have reason to believe your friend Morrison may not be who he claims." "I don't believe it," Grace said firmly. "Wyatt has been nothing but honorable since arriving in Silverstone." "Maybe so," Sheriff Tate said, his tone softening. "But we need to find him and get to the bottom of this. If you see him, send word immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." After they left, Grace paced her small room above the store, her mind racing. Could Wyatt really be involved with outlaws? It seemed impossible, yet there was so much about his past he hadn't shared. She was still wrestling with her doubts when a soft knock sounded at her back door. Grace froze, then cautiously approached. "Who is it?" she called. "Grace, it's me." Wyatt's voice was low and urgent. "Please let me in." She hesitated only briefly before unbolting the door. Wyatt slipped inside, his expression tense. He was dressed for the trail, a saddlebag slung over his shoulder. "You're leaving," she said, her voice flat. "I heard Fletcher's in town." Wyatt ran a hand through his hair. "I need to explain before he feeds you his version of events." "Then explain," Grace said, crossing her arms. "Was your name even Wyatt Morrison in Texas?" "Yes," he said. "That much is true. I was a deputy, like I told you, in a small town called Redwater." "And this Jack Wilson, the bank robber," Wyatt's jaw tightened. "My brother-in-law." "My sister's husband." Grace's eyes widened. "Your sister?" "Sarah," Wyatt said, the name filled with pain. "She was everything good in this world, Grace. Married Wilson thinking he was an honest rancher. By the time she discovered otherwise, she was expecting their child." "What happened?" Grace asked softly. "Wilson got involved with a gang, started robbing banks, stagecoaches. I tried to convince Sarah to leave him, but she believed she could change him." Wyatt's voice broke. "One night the gang robbed the Redwater Bank. The owner tried to stop them and Wilson shot him dead." Grace gasped. "And you were the deputy?" "I was supposed to bring my own brother-in-law to justice," Wyatt confirmed. "But when I confronted him, Sarah stepped between us. There was a struggle. My gun went off." His eyes closed briefly. "Sarah died in my arms." "Oh, Wyatt," Grace whispered. "Wilson escaped. Spread word that I'd killed my sister deliberately to cover up my own involvement with the gang." Wyatt's hands clenched into fists. "Marshal Fletcher believed him. I had to run or hang for a crime I didn't commit. And now Wilson is headed here. If Fletcher's information is correct." Wyatt looked at her intently. "Grace, I have to find him before Fletcher does. Wilson is the only one who knows the truth about what happened that night." Grace's mind was spinning. "What will you do if you find him? Bring him to justice the right way. Make him confess." Wyatt stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "Grace, I know I have no right to ask, but I need your help. Just for tonight. Then I'll be gone, and you'll never have to see me again." The thought of never seeing him again caused a sharp pain in Grace's chest. Despite everything, she believed him. Believed in him. "What do you need?" Relief washed over his features. "Just a place to rest for a few hours. I've been riding hard all day, checking every trail into town. I need to be fresh when I pick up Wilson's trail tomorrow." Grace nodded. "You can stay here, but first, you need to eat something." While Wyatt rested on her small sofa, Grace prepared a simple meal from the store's provisions. As they ate, she studied his face in the lamplight. There was a weariness there that went beyond physical exhaustion, the look of a man who had carried a heavy burden for far too long. "How will you find Wilson?" she asked. "He has friends in the area. A former gang member named Rivera runs a saloon about 20 miles north of here." Wyatt pushed his plate away. "If Wilson's headed this way, he'll stop there. And what if Fletcher finds you first? Then I'll have to convince him to listen to the truth." Wyatt's expression was grim, though he hasn't been inclined to do so in the past. Grace reached across the table and took his hand. "I believe you, Wyatt, and I'll help you any way I can." The gratitude in his eyes made her heart twist. "You're an extraordinary woman, Grace Gallagher." "Hardly," she demurred. "Just someone who knows what it's like to start over, to try to outrun the past." Wyatt's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "When this is over, if I clear my name, would you consider—" A loud pounding on the front door interrupted him. "Miss Gallagher, open up." Grace's eyes flew to Wyatt's. "It's Fletcher," she whispered. Wyatt was on his feet instantly. "Is there a back way out?" "The storeroom has a door that leads to the alley," Grace said, already moving. "But your horse, I left him at the livery." Wyatt grabbed his saddlebag. "Grace, if I don't come back, you will," she insisted, pressing a small bundle of food into his hands. "Now go." As Wyatt slipped into the storeroom, Grace straightened her dress and went to answer the front door. Marshal Fletcher stood there with Sheriff Tate, both looking grim. "Evening, gentlemen," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "What can I do for you at this late hour?" "We need to search your premises, Miss Gallagher," Fletcher said without preamble. "We have reason to believe Morrison might try to contact you." "That's absurd," Grace replied, hoping her face didn't betray her. "And completely improper. I'm a respectable woman living alone." Sheriff Tate had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Miss Gallagher, we don't mean to cause offense, but this is a serious matter." "If it's so serious, perhaps you should tell me what exactly Deputy Morrison is accused of," Grace challenged. "Conspiracy to robbery and murder," Fletcher said bluntly. "He's been running for 2 years, using his badge to hide in plain sight." Grace feigned shock, buying time. "I can't believe that. He's been nothing but honorable since arriving in Silverstone." "Appearances can be deceiving, madam," Fletcher pressed. "Now, are you going to let us in, or do we need to come back with more men?" Grace reluctantly stepped aside. As the men searched her living quarters, she prayed Wyatt had made it safely away. When they reached the storeroom, her heart pounded so loudly she was certain they must hear it. "Looks clear," Sheriff Tate said finally. "For now," Fletcher added, his suspicious gaze lingering on Grace. "If he contacts you, Miss Gallagher, it would be in your best interest to inform us immediately. Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense." After they left, Grace sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. She had just lied to a U.S. Marshal. If Wyatt was telling the truth, she had done the right thing. If not, she didn't sleep that night. At dawn, she opened the store as usual, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy despite her churning thoughts. Mid-morning, a boy from the telegraph office delivered a message. "Meet at sunset. Rivera's Crossing. Bring no one. W." Grace's hands trembled as she read the brief note. Rivera's Crossing was a small ford over the creek north of town near the saloon Wyatt had mentioned. He must have found something. The day crawled by with excruciating slowness. Grace served customers mechanically, her mind occupied with plans and fears. When closing time finally came, she quickly changed into her riding clothes and slipped out the back way to the livery stable. The sun was low on the horizon as she approached Rivera's Crossing. The creek burbled peacefully, contrasting with the tension coiled inside her. There was no sign of Wyatt. "You shouldn't have come." Grace whirled around to find Wyatt emerging from the trees, leading his horse. He looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and several days' growth of beard. "Your message said to meet you," she reminded him. "I meant I would come to you after dark," he clarified. "It's not safe here." "Did you find Wilson?" Wyatt nodded grimly. "He was at Rivera's, just as I expected, but he spotted me before I could approach him. He's hiding out in an abandoned mine about a mile from here." "What are you going to do?" "Go after him," Wyatt said simply. "End this once and for all." Grace dismounted, moving closer to him. "Not alone, you're not. Fletcher and his men are combing the hills. They could be anywhere." "All the more reason for you to return to town," Wyatt argued. "I won't have you caught in the crossfire. And I won't have you facing this alone," Grace countered. 2 years, Wyatt. You've carried this burden for 2 years. Let me help you." The conflict was clear on his face, his desire to protect her warring with his need for her support. Finally, he nodded. "The mine entrance is hidden behind a stand of cottonwoods," he explained. "Wilson has supplies for several days. He's waiting for the search to move on before he tries to leave the territory." "So we wait him out?" "No," Wyatt's expression hardened. "We go in tonight. The longer we wait, the greater the chance Fletcher finds us both." As twilight deepened into night, they left their horses tethered in a hidden gully and approached the mine on foot. The entrance was just as Wyatt had described, barely visible behind a thick growth of trees and brush. "Stay behind me," Wyatt whispered, drawing his revolver. "If anything happens, you run. Don't look back." The mine tunnel was dark and close, smelling of damp earth and decay. Wyatt moved silently, guided by a thin strip of light that grew stronger as they progressed deeper. They rounded a bend, and Grace could see the source, a small campfire illuminating a wider chamber. A man sat beside the fire, his back to them, cleaning a rifle. Even from behind, Grace could see he was lean and wiry, with dark hair streaked with gray. "It's over, Jack," Wyatt called, his revolver aimed steadily. Wilson spun around, reaching for his weapon, but froze when he saw Wyatt's gun trained on him. "Morrison," he spat. "Should have known you'd find me eventually." "Put the rifle down," Wyatt ordered, slowly. Wilson complied, his movements deliberately casual. "You gonna shoot me, brother? Like you shot Sarah?" "You know that's not what happened." Wyatt's voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "Sarah died because of you, because she was trying to stop you from killing me." "That your story now?" Wilson's eyes flicked to Grace, noticing her for the first time. "Who's the lady?" "Another innocent you've dragged into your mess. Leave her out of this," Wyatt warned. "This is between you and me." "Always the hero," Wilson sneered. "Deputy Morrison, the righteous lawman." "Does she know what really happened that night? How you were skimming money from the very banks your gang was robbing?" "That's a lie," Wyatt said evenly. "Just like everything else you've told Fletcher." "Is it?" Wilson's gaze remained fixed on Grace. "Ask him about the money they found in his house. Ask him why the bank owner recognized him before Wilson shot him." Grace glanced at Wyatt, whose face remained impassive. "I trust him," she said firmly, "which is more than anyone could say about you." Wilson laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the chamber. "Lady, you don't know him at all." "I'm taking you in, Jack," Wyatt said, stepping forward. "You're going to tell Fletcher the truth." "And why would I do that?" Wilson's hand inched toward his boot. "Because it's the only way you leave this mine alive," Wyatt replied. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for justice for Sarah and for me." Something changed in Wilson's expression, a flicker of calculation. "Maybe we can make a deal." "No deals," Wyatt said. "Just the truth." Wilson's move was lightning fast. His hand whipped up from his boot with a small derringer. Wyatt lunged forward, tackling Wilson just as the gun went off, the shot deafening in the confined space. Grace screamed as the two men crashed to the ground, grappling for control. Wilson was smaller but fought with the desperate strength of a cornered animal. They rolled dangerously close to the fire, knocking over a pot of water that hissed and steamed on the hot coals. "Grace, get back," Wyatt shouted, narrowly avoiding Wilson's attempt to gouge his eyes. But Grace didn't retreat. Instead, she grabbed a thick branch from the firewood pile and swung it with all her might, catching Wilson on the side of the head. He slumped, momentarily stunned, giving Wyatt the opening he needed to pin him down and secure his hands with a length of rope. "Are you hurt?" Grace asked anxiously, noticing a dark stain spreading on Wyatt's shirt. "Just grazed," he assured her, though his face was pale with pain. "We need to get him back to town." Wilson regained consciousness as they were binding his feet. "You're making a mistake," he muttered groggily. "Fletcher will never believe you." "He'll believe evidence," Wyatt said, searching through Wilson's saddlebags. "And I'm betting you kept something that ties you to those robberies. Men like you always do." Wilson's expression confirmed Wyatt's suspicion. After a thorough search, Wyatt found a pouch hidden in the lining of the saddlebag containing several distinctive gold coins and a unique pocket watch. "The bank owner's watch," Wyatt said softly. "The one that was reported missing after his murder." He looked at Wilson with a mixture of disgust and pity. You kept it as a trophy. Dawn was breaking as they led a bound Wilson back to Silverstone. They were halfway there when they encountered Fletcher and his posse. "Hold it right there, Morrison," Fletcher called, rifles leveling at them. "Marshal Fletcher," Wyatt acknowledged calmly. "I've brought you Jack Wilson." Fletcher's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "And why would you do that?" "Because he's the man you've been looking for all along," Wyatt said. "The real bank robber and murderer." "That's not what Wilson told us 2 years ago," Fletcher countered. "Of course not," Grace interjected. "He was saving himself." Fletcher gave her a dismissive glance. "Stay out of this, miss. You don't know what you're involved in." "Actually, I do," Grace stood her ground. "And if you're half the lawman you claim to be, you'll listen to what Wyatt has to say before jumping to conclusions." Something in her tone gave Fletcher pause. "All right, Morrison, you've got 5 minutes." Wyatt showed Fletcher the watch and coins. "These were taken from Samuel Dutton the night he was murdered in Redwater. Wilson kept them all this time." Fletcher examined the items, his expression unreadable. "Could have been your share of the take." "Then ask him," Wyatt challenged, gesturing to Wilson. "Ask him how he knew where to find these if I was the one who took them. Ask him about the scar on his right hand that the bank teller described." Fletcher's gaze shifted to Wilson, who was glaring at Wyatt with undisguised hatred. "He's lying," Wilson snarled. "He was always in on it." "Ask him about the money in his house." "The money you planted after killing my sister," Wyatt countered. "The money you knew Fletcher would find because you told him exactly where to look." A tense silence fell. Fletcher looked between the two men, weighing their words. "There's one way to settle this," he said finally. "Wilson, if Morrison was your partner, you'd know things about him, things only someone close would know." "Like what?" Wilson asked warily. "Like where he grew up, his parents' names, how he got that scar on his chin." Wilson's confidence faltered. "We weren't friends. We were just business partners." "Convenient," Fletcher remarked dryly. "Morrison, same questions." "Jack Wilson was born Jacob Williamson in East Texas," Wyatt replied without hesitation. "Changed his name after a run-in with the law in '68. Has a younger brother in San Antonio and a special talent for cards, which is how he met my sister. The scar on his hand came from a knife fight in El Paso 3 years ago." Wilson's expression confirmed every word. Fletcher studied him thoughtfully, then turned to Wyatt. "That doesn't prove your innocence," he pointed out. "No," Wyatt agreed, "but this might." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. "My sister's letter, written the day before she died. I found it among her things afterward. She knew Wilson was planning something big. She was going to leave him." Fletcher read the letter, his brow furrowed. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "Take Wilson back to town," he ordered his deputies, "and secure him properly. I want 4 men guarding him at all times." As Wilson was led away, cursing, Fletcher turned back to Wyatt. "This isn't conclusive, Morrison, but it's enough to make me question what I thought I knew." "That's all I'm asking for," Wyatt said. "A fair hearing." Fletcher nodded. "You'll get it. But until then, consider yourself in custody as well." Grace started to protest, but Wyatt shook his head. "It's all right, Grace. This is how it should be. The law has to take its course." The next few weeks were the longest of Grace's life. Wyatt and Wilson were both held in the Silverstone jail while Fletcher sent telegrams to Texas, gathering evidence and testimonies. Grace visited Wyatt daily, bringing food and clean clothes, sitting with him for the allowed hour. "You should distance yourself from me," Wyatt told her during one such visit. "The town's talking. It's not good for your reputation or your business." "Let them talk," Grace replied firmly. "I know the truth, and soon everyone else will too." Finally, a judge arrived from Tucson to hear the case. The trial was held in the town hall, packed with curious onlookers. Grace sat in the front row, her heart in her throat as witnesses were called and evidence presented. Wilson maintained his story at first, but as the testimonies mounted against him, including a surprise appearance by his former gang member Rivera, who had decided to save his own skin, his resolve crumbled. When confronted with the damning evidence of the watch and his own contradictory statements, he finally broke. "Fine," he shouted. Morrison wasn't part of it, but he still shot Sarah. "In self-defense," Wyatt said quietly, "after you used her as a shield." The judge, a stern man with penetrating eyes, considered all the evidence before delivering his verdict. Wilson was found guilty of multiple counts of robbery and murder, sentenced to hang, and Wyatt Morrison was cleared of all charges. As they left the courthouse, Grace beside him, Wyatt seemed dazed by his newfound freedom. "I never thought this day would come," he admitted. "After 2 years of running, of looking over my shoulder." "What will you do now?" Grace asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Wyatt stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether a certain mercantile owner might be interested in having a former deputy sheriff court her properly." His eyes held a question, a hope. Grace's heart soared. "I think she might be very interested indeed." Wyatt's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "In that case, Miss Gallagher, would you do me the honor of accompanying me to dinner tomorrow evening?" "I would be delighted, Mr. Morrison," she replied, her own smile matching his. Sheriff Tate, impressed by Wyatt's handling of the Wilson case, offered him his old job back. Wyatt accepted, on the condition that he could set his own hours to help Grace with the heavier work at the mercantile. Over the next months, their courtship blossomed. Wyatt became a fixture at the store, building new shelves, unloading deliveries, and charming the customers with his easy manner. Grace found her business thriving, partly due to curiosity about her relationship with the deputy, but increasingly because of the improved inventory and service they offered together. By Christmas, the entire town knew that Deputy Morrison and Miss Gallagher were inseparable. When he escorted her to the holiday social, no one was surprised to see a small gold ring gleaming on her left hand. Their wedding, held on a perfect spring day in 1879, was the social event of the season. The entire town turned out to witness the union of the handsome deputy and the determined mercantile owner who had found love where they least expected it. After the ceremony, as they greeted well-wishers, Grace caught sight of a familiar figure, Marshal Fletcher, standing at the back of the crowd. "You came," Wyatt said, extending his hand to the marshal. "Seemed fitting," Fletcher replied, shaking Wyatt's hand firmly. "Not often I get to see a happy ending to a case like yours." "Thank you," Grace said sincerely, "for being willing to listen to the truth, even when it wasn't what you expected to hear." Fletcher tipped his hat to her. "Madam, in my line of work, the unexpected is often where justice is found. You two take care of each other." As the celebration continued into the evening, Wyatt led Grace away from the crowd, toward the small house they had purchased together on the edge of town. "Happy, Mrs. Morrison?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "Who would have thought it all began with a bucket I couldn't lift?" Wyatt laughed, the sound warm in the twilight. "Best day of my life, seeing you struggle with that water. Gave me an excuse to talk to the most beautiful woman in Silverstone." "Is that so?" Grace raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought you were just being neighborly." "Well, that too," he admitted with a grin. "But mainly I was looking for any reason to see you smile." Grace reached up to touch his face. "You've given me more reasons to smile than I can count, Wyatt Morrison." He lowered his head, kissing her softly. "And I intend to keep doing so for the rest of our lives." As the years passed, Silverstone grew from a rough mining town into a respectable community. The Morrison Mercantile expanded to become the largest store in the county, offering everything from basic supplies to the latest fashions from back east. Wyatt eventually left his deputy position to work full-time alongside Grace, their partnership in business as successful as their marriage. Their home, once a small cottage, grew to accommodate their expanding family, first William, born a year after their wedding, then Emma 2 years later, and finally little Sarah, named for the aunt she would never know but whose story would become part of family lore. On their 10th anniversary, Wyatt surprised Grace by taking her back to the town well where they had first met. It had been replaced by a more modern pump years ago, but the original bucket still hung beside it as a reminder of simpler times. "Remember this?" he asked, lifting the old wooden bucket with ease. "How could I forget?" Grace laughed. "I was trying so hard to be independent, to prove I didn't need anyone's help. And I was trying so hard not to fall in love with you on the spot," Wyatt confessed. "Failed miserably at that." Grace leaned against him, watching their children play nearby. "I'm glad you did." "You know," Wyatt said thoughtfully, "in all our years together, I don't think I've ever properly thanked you." "For what?" "For believing in me when no one else would. For standing by me through the trial. For being willing to build a life with a man who came with so much baggage." Grace turned in his arms. "And I never properly thanked you for seeing strength in me when others saw only a widow trying to do a man's job. For respecting my independence while still offering your support." Wyatt brushed a strand of hair from her face, now showing the first strands of silver. "We make a good team, Grace Morrison." "The best," she agreed, stretching up to kiss him. As the sun set over Silverstone, casting long shadows across the town they had helped build, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From a chance meeting at a well to a life filled with love, family, and purpose. She had come west seeking independence and a fresh start, never imagining she would find a partner who would respect her strength while offering his own. And it had all begun with a bucket she couldn't lift alone, and a cowboy who had smiled softly at her.